queda uno ahí. Dale. Eso es. Muy bien. Toma, Estrella. Estre. Ay, chateamos tanto, mira. Mira. Eso es. Toma, acá tengo más. No, acá en esta. Eso. Muy bien, esta mona. Ay, sí. Le está tirando el pelo a Maru. No los tires. Allá. No hay más de esas. No, ya no hay más.
Congratulations on the documentary. It's amazing.
Thank you.
So my name's Paul, on behalf of Film Awards TV. Thank you so much for letting us see a sneak preview of your documentary. It will be premiering at the BFI London Film Festival, so we're very excited about that. This documentary, what was your vision behind it, and kind of what did you hope to achieve?
That's an interesting question. I go into making films with a very open idea. I don't really have a set idea. I knew that I tend to work a lot with natural history and animals and kind of conservation themes within ecology, but also within museums. And for this film, I was particularly interested. My family's from Argentina, and I used to spend quite a bit of time in the Buenos Aires Zoo. And I was particularly interested at the beginning in the architecture of the zoo, where the animals are living in replicas of architecture of where the countries where they originate from. So, for example, the elephants are living in a Hindu temple. Before it used to be Indian elephants living in a Hindu temple, and now it's African elephants living in a Hindu temple. So there's like this kind of absurdism to this as well. And then from there, I had issues with access to the zoo that eventually we were able to film there. But because of this lack of access or these difficulties, I began to spend time with the carers at the zoo, the carers that work with the animals. And that's kind of where the film ended up going more, was to the side of the relationship between the carers and the animals. There is like a whole historical part, which includes the architecture of the zoo kind of in the center of the film. But all the other ends have to do with kind of the relationship between the animals and their carers.
I think you can really see that as well. There's some beautiful points where you can see them fixing all the statues and like brushing off the little bits. You can see there's a real passion that they have down there. And that's one thing I was thinking when I was watching it. I was like, these carers are really quite patient, and they're really like, you can see they really actually care for the animals, did you have any favorite animals down there?
It's a difficult question. I think Juanita, who's one of the main characters, was probably one of my favorites. And then I have a fascination with turtles. They're such incredible and strange animals that I could stare for them for years and just live watching turtles, I think.
Turtles or tortoises? Because I always get those two confused.
In Spanish, it's tortugas. It's because I would say it in Spanish. In Spanish, the species are called yaboti, and they're tortugas, which I think it's turtles, but I have to look it up, the translation.
Why did you decide to shoot on film? Was it just what was available, or was there a stylistic choice?
I've been working on 16mm since I started making films in 2006. So it really is my medium, like a painter would choose oil or or acrylic. So it really is my medium. That's the main reason why. There is also, so we didn't really film a lot. The film took 5 years to make, and we were shooting on and off for 5 years, but there's probably around 6 or 7 hours max of footage that we shot. And that's what the discipline of working on film. So I might have gone in to meet Maga for one day, one of the carers. And I only had maybe 10 minutes of film. So the majority of the day was just hanging out with her and spending time with the animals, with the carers, with the people that work there. So there was this like it pushes you to kind of have this relationship with the people, which is kind of why I make films. And Maga is a friend of mine, like Majo as well. These people are people that I've like built relationships with over the years. And film kind of allows for that. If I had a digital camera and I had like all the footage, all these memory cards that I was able to use, it would have been a very different experience. I would have felt like I had to be recording the whole time. But in this case, I sometimes would just go in and not film anything because it's so costly and there's so much of it. So I really enjoy that kind of aspect of shooting on film practically, and then obviously the texture of it and the kind of the materiality of it as well.
What were some of the other challenges you faced making this documentary?
Well, that was the biggest challenge, is like that, the lack of access that we eventually got. And then also there were times where, because we started shooting in 2019, COVID hit kind of in the middle, which also made things like a little bit more difficult. But my previous film took 4 years to make, and the one before that took 5 years to make as well. So the time element of it isn't something negative that I think about. I like taking a while to make films. But yeah, those were the two main aspects of, and also just, I mean, I wouldn't say that it was a challenge to film with carers and animals and their relationship, and having to kind of always listen to what the animals were doing or wanted that day. So we might have gone in and had an idea of maybe more or less what we wanted to film, but then we couldn't because the animal didn't want to come out of its enclosure that day. So that's the way that the carers work with the animals, is they're always kind of listening to them and responding to them. So we were doing the same with the animals, but also with the carers, because the carers might have had a day where they couldn't do something, or they had to do admin and things like that. So it was like that consistently, which is a challenge, but it's the film.
So did you always know this was something you kind of wanted to do?
I remember that my dad had a picture of us, of my mum and I, when I was little, standing in front of the elephant's Hindu temple. And it was something that I used to look at a lot. And there was a lot at that time. So the zoo closed in 2016. It reopened in 2019. They renamed it an eco park. And there was one particular elephant, the last Indian elephant, Mada, which they were planning to move, which they did translocate in 2020, in June 2020, like the middle of the pandemic, to Brazil, to a sanctuary. And that was kind of when there was news of like that movement and that image that I had of my mum and I standing in front of a Hindu temple, but it being in Buenos Aires Zoo, with one of the elephants. And I was always curious if that elephant, when I was 5, was the same elephant that was translocated. So I think that was really the first thing that kind of sparked it. But it definitely isn't a new theme. It's something that's like, that I'm generally interested in, and comes from the other projects and the other films that I've worked previously in.
How do you like support yourself? How do you kind of get like funding to make these movies?
The secret is you have other jobs. I teach, I work as a projectionist. I work as a cinematographer as well. That's the secret, is that you do other things to be able to live. And then funding comes from a mixture of, we started off by getting funding from a private investor in the UK, Other Pictures, and then we had Hubert Bowles Fund in Rotterdam. Then I did a residency in Spain in Igumira, where there was also a little bit of funding. There was like a lot of pockets of funding at the beginning. I also was a resident at the Film Study Center at Harvard University, so all the equipment came from them. We were using their cameras, which, I mean, the film is in documentary competition, so it's kind of key maybe to mention that the camera that I used was Robert Gardner's camera, who was an anthropologist and a filmmaker, who made films like Dead Birds in the 1960s. So we were able to use that equipment from them. And then I partnered with the Argentinian producer, and we got national funding, which is INCA, which is Argentinian national funding, which helped us really with the main bit of filming. And then there's also debt, unfortunately. But yeah, the Argentinian fund was a huge help. And unfortunately, with the state of things in Argentina at the moment, we wouldn't have really been able to shoot the main part of the film with the way the government is closing down and getting rid of culture and science over there. We've made in these past few years with that funding, unfortunately. Hopefully, we'll keep on fighting for that not to continue, but that's the state it's in at the moment. It's that fund is pretty much shut down.
What drives you? I mean, what keeps you going?
People, the relationships that I have with the people that I work with Maga, with Majo, with the people that are participating on screen in the film, this is really the first time that I've worked with, even though it's a small crew of 4 of us, it was just an incredible relationship with Flor. I did the cinematography, and then I had a camera assistant, Flor Lavat. The sound recordist, Guido Ronconi, and the general assistant, Flor Vacado. Those are the people that, like, those relationships and wanting to be surrounded by these people is really what keeps me going. Post-production, worked with a sound designer that I've been working with for 10 years, Philippe Champy. So, like, those kinds of relationships.
What's something you would want to change, something bad that you think needs to change about the conservation?
I think needs to change. I wish it were that easy. It's process. I think something that I hope that's highlighted somehow in the film is that we have a history. So these zoos, unfortunately, were created in the 1800s for particular reasons of power, of education, of actually, like, the word conservation was used back then as for what they were doing. So that's also interesting how language fluctuates. What we think of conservation now isn't what conservation was in the early 1900s. But so I think something that I think is key when we look at zoos, we're like, oh, we want to free all the animals, which would be amazing, but it's not possible for a lot of them. It's a process. Firstly, it's costly, and there's hardly any money to even feed animals, and a lot of the carers are even paying out of pocket for the food that they're eating. And it's costly to translocate animals. So a lot of the time that's an issue. So it's like a little bit of funding, thinking of it case by case, animal by animal, thinking about the individual needs of an animal. And then some of the animals are too old, or what I am very firm on is that no, there should be no collection of animals, which both in museums and in zoos. So whether it's killing an animal and putting it in a museum, in a natural history museum, or whether it's collecting an animal and putting it in alive within a zoo, that's something that isn't happening anymore in these Argentinian zoos. and shouldn't happen in other zoos around the world.
Do you think it's very different for countries like the UK, like the zoos, like the carers in your documentary seemed like they really were looking after these animals, you know?
I'm not actually sure because I haven't worked on the floor with carers at zoos in the UK or in the US. So for that, I'm not sure about, but I know that there are, it's really, again, it's kind of about the individual. I think the film has a lot to do with the body of an institution and the body of an individual working. We have like these contrasts and conflicts between the institution and the people that are actually working on the ground. So I think, yeah, I'm not sure. What I do know is that, for example, in Vienna Zoo, in a few other zoos in Europe, animals are still procreating. So there was, in 2019, there was a birth of an elephant in Vienna. I was in Toronto recently with the film, and I was talking to a taxi driver, telling him about the film, and he was telling me how there was, I think, a panda that had just been born in the Toronto Zoo. So this to me is really crazy that animals are still being born in zoos. In the zoos that I worked with in La Plata Zoo and in Buenos Aires Zoo, the idea is, which is also, if you like, a kind of absurd idea, but the zoos are meant to not have to only really have animals that are native to Argentina within the zoos, although obviously they're not native to zoos. So all the elephants and the giraffes and things like that is like slowly they wouldn't exist anymore in zoos in Argentina.
What's something positive that you think everyone can kind of do that would kind of make a big impact to like conservations and just helping out?
It's so hard to say something that everyone can do. I think the biggest issues are the institutions and the industries. And it has a lot to do with listening, I think. Listening to each other as human beings and understanding situations where horrendous situations that people are in because of climate change and because of the way that we have treated the planet for so many years. Listening and then acting on what we're hearing rather than just kind of ignoring and thinking of other things that could continue destroying the world. My biggest thing is continuing to ask questions and being curious. And I think as humans, we should be doing that as much as possible as well, and having respect for other beings.
The whole problem that was meant to solve was kind of saving the oceans, but all the things being used in the oceans, like the nets, are still there. But yet the whole world stopped using plastic straws. Like to me, it doesn't really make sense. But you know?
I mean, on Instagram, you're always being fed like toothbrushes that are made out of wood and things like that. But then it's like, but what happens to the toothbrush you have already, the plastic one? Like, are you throwing that away to use the wooden one? Like, just continue using the one that you have until it really, really, really doesn't work anymore.
Yeah,
that's my kind of like this idea of like consuming and capitalism is terrible. Whether we're like starting to use renewable materials, like eventually I think that's great, but continue using what you have until it's really like not in use anymore and there's no way to fix it. Rather than getting a new one, change the battery. I don't know, those kinds of things.
Yeah. Is there anything that you would recommend an aspiring documentary maker to watch, or is there a documentary you'd want them to watch?
One of my favorite films is a film by Chick Strand, who was a Californian filmmaker who worked a lot in Mexico, and she made an amazing film called Fake Fruit Factory, and I would recommend anyone to watch that. And you can also watch that online. I know that it's online for access. So that's what I would recommend for people to see. It's 26 minutes of joy and pleasure and questions, and this idea of the institution, factories, and people that work there. There's like a lot intertwined, and she uses a lot of close-ups as well, and textures and colors, and yeah, I recommend that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. See you soon.